right. So, okay, yes, the microphone is on. So I should warn you before we start out that since this is a longer talk, it's a 40-minute talk, and I'm going to try to keep it to 30 for questions, there will be audience participation in groups and pairs. So if you are sitting at a table by yourself, you may want to move to a table with other people in it. Just saying. So you can follow along with the slides online or afterwards. And by way of introduction, I'm Mel. I used to be a good little engineering student until I discovered the wonderful joys of the open source world. Worked in industry at Red Hat, at the Open Planning Project, at One Laptop Per Child for a while. Gradually started explaining more and more often how open source stuff worked to professors who were interested in having their students become hackers. And that led me back to graduate school. And that's sort of where I'm coming from today, as a hacker who spent 2 years stuck in graduate classes and can now condense and summarize 2 years of my life into 40 minutes of yours. And so here is a relatively familiar scene, and this is something that I think is extremely silly, where most formal learning looks like this. And that points one of the giant differences between the hacker world that we're used to over here and the academic world on top. The top has a very linear process. You know how long it's going to take you, what classes you're required to take, and you're not really sure what you're going to do with it at the end. But in the world that many of us at PyCon are more used to, we have this weird mess. We know what we're trying to accomplish sometimes, but we're not sure exactly how we're going to get there. And so because these two worlds of learning come from very, very different paradigms, sometimes it's difficult for them to cross-talk to each other. And I wanted to start off with confidence, Kat, and say, personally, I think that this way is the better way of doing things. But we need to learn how to explain and articulate it to other people so we can share it and also reflect and metacognitate on what we're doing so we can better refine our own processes for learning. So this talk has 3 big ideas. And we'll start off with the first one, which is we can think about designing learning exactly the same way we think about designing good code. This is where the audience participation part comes in. This is practice. We'll do something called think, pair, share. We'll give you a moment to ruminate by yourselves, and then a minute or so to share it with whoever's sitting by you. And then if you have this brilliant insight that you want to share with the rest of the room, there are microphones, and Ian will also be running around with something for whoever raises their hand. So, if you are teaching somebody how to program, what steps in the process, what order would you usually put these steps in the process? So, thinking? And when you're ready, you can turn to your neighbors and start debating what, if anything, you might do. Okay, so this is a practice round, so I don't want to take too much time for it. But can we get maybe 1 or 2 groups just saying what they think, or what they came up with? Anybody? Hand? Microphone. Thank you.
For the minimal amount of teaching I've done, A, B.
B.
No, A.
Prototype.
Then B.
First A, then B?
Yeah. And never got as far as teaching people to write tests.
Okay. So these are 3 different elements that you can use when you're thinking about designing code, writing code. And it's not that any one of them is necessarily the right answer or first or dominant, but you can see that perhaps all three of them are complementary somehow. And so we see this in our code. Right? And the purposes of these things is specification. What is this thing supposed to do? And then the test is, how am I going to know if it does what it's supposed to do? And then there's the actual stuff that does things. And the thing is that you can do this for teaching as well. Right? So if this is the specification, right, this is basically what should students be able to do at the end of my lesson thing. And here's how we're going to check whether they do it for some magical function here. And then here's a bunch of stuff that will run them through paces. And the words that we use pedagogically for that is content, assessment, and pedagogy. And so the thing is, a lot of times, even if we think that's test-driven development for writing code, when we think about teaching code, we go, oh my God, pedagogy is shiny. I have the greatest idea for a really fun activity. And we don't quite step back and think, what was this supposed to teach? How will I check whether this achieves its intended outcome? It's fine to backfill. It's fine to do these in whatever order. But if you're trying to be deliberate about conveying information to somebody else, these are the three components that you have to have in place and lined up. So one dependency of this is that you need to be able to articulate your goals in a clear manner. And so there are handy little things all over educational literature that will give you nice little words that you can use to slot in where you might want to have understanding. And Bloom's taxonomy is the most familiar one. One thing I do want to point out is that a lot of people look at the bottom of the stack and say, oh, remember, understand, that's about memorization and so forth. And we really want to spend all of our time up here in creation and evaluation and that high-level stuff. One is not better than the other. If there are only so many times you can explain to somebody exactly how to spell the word print before you really want them to just remember that this is the command that does X. So the other thing with this example is that it smacks of a behaviorist philosophy, which is the idea that people are like this little black box. You run them through an activity. They go through this magical black box. Something happens. They come out the other end, and they know how to press the lever. They got food. And this has gotten a bit of a bad rap sometimes, in that we think, behaviorists, they're oversimplifying everything. We're much more than black boxes. We can press two levers and get different kinds of food. But it is also useful and very common. So for instance, the Boston Python workshop, which is this wonderful movement that's teaching programming to women and their friends, uses coding bat. And coding bat is totally behaviorist because look, do this thing, press the button. If it's correct, you get a green letter saying, congratulations, you've succeeded. Completely behaviorist. Most computer-assisted learning tools work this way and operate under this paradigm. So this is just a little bit of recognition of stuff that we already do. And another thing that behaviorist thinking does really well is assessment. And coding bat does both formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment is feedback that you get on the way to your goal. And if you're working on a project, if you're working in a community, you got tons and tons of formative assessment. This is stuff when you do code review. This is when you sit down next to someone and say, does it work? This is when you have your test and you're running and you're like, all right, 3 out of 5 are passing. I'm on my way. And in contrast, most of what we're used to in school is summative assessment, also known as grading. So a little bit more vocabulary. So this was the first section. I want to zoom out of behaviorism a little bit because this is just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of many different ways you can think about learning and teaching and educational psychology. So we are going to the second part now, which is cognitive. I talked about how behaviorist thinking is brain as black box. We don't really know, and we don't really care what goes in there as long as when you come out the other side, you can press the little lever. In contrast, the cognitive folks started thinking a bit down the line, that's silly. It really does matter what's going on in my brain. It matters how efficient my cognitive schemas are. Basically, there are some ways we can arrange information so it will make sense more than other ways. And I think Python itself is a brilliant example of this. One thing that I personally really like about Python, and I've heard over and over again, is that it fits in your brain nicely. It's a small language, it's relatively simple to understand compared to some other things out there, and it fits in your brain nicely, and it just works nicely with the way you think. And so Python has a good cognitive design schema as opposed to, say, x86 assembly. And so, once again, confidence cap. And so the second of our big ideas goes along these lines. Everybody's brain is different, and everybody learns differently, which is a fairly obvious statement to make. And so we're now going to go into the massive blitz round of think, pair, share. Some researchers called Bandura and Solomon have done a whole bunch of things on different learning styles specifically for engineers. So you might have heard things like kinesthetic, visual, verbal, learner, different modalities. This is specifically for engineers because it turns out the technical people are a little bit different and things play out a little bit differently in the technical world as opposed to everything about learning ever. And so what I'd like to do for each of these is I'll give you a quick overview of what each of these 4 pairs is about. And then with your think, pair, share, we'll want you to think about which one you think you might be and an example from your own learning life that illustrates how either something worked really well for you in a style or really didn't. So, first pair, active reflective. And this particular slide causes me great joy because for the first time since I started speaking, my parents are in the audience, so I get to embarrass them. My father, hi Mom and Dad. So my father is a very, very active learner, and sort of the catchphrase for active learners is let's try it out, let's go do things. My mom is more reflective. She's the one that tends to go on vacations with like 3 different kinds of aspirin and 5 types of splints. So let's think it through. And active and reflective learners have, as you might guess, really, really different styles in dealing with problems and puzzles and things. So for instance, which style do you reckon is more likely to do task-driven development? Like, who's more likely to stop before plunging in the code and say, maybe I should write a spec first. Maybe I should write tests. And who'd like to go, shiny buttons? I take after my father, by the way. So different approaches to problems, and you can also see how if you have an active learner and a reflective learner pairing on the same piece of code, they might start running into a bunch of clashes because one wants to go faster and the other wants to step back and the other wants to plunge ahead. And so sometimes these sorts of learning differences can also be the source of conflict between teams if you don't step back and say, oh, that's because we're different. And if you take advantage of it and have people do the roles they're good at, so the reflective person stepping back and sort of backfilling in the comments, and the active person's like, the shiny thing, then it can work well instead of horribly. For both kinds of learners, though, a lecture sucks, because the active learner can't go forward, and the reflective learner has no time to pause. But that's exactly what you need to do if you find yourself in a situation that doesn't fit your brain. If you're an active learner and you find yourself stuck in a stupid lecture situation for some reason, figure out how to get explaining groups in. After class, outside of class, during breaks, have something like talk with another person, blog, tweet, whatever it is you want to do, so you get that engagement and you get that ability to try things out. And if you're a reflective learner, once in a while, just stop paying attention completely and take your time to reflect. So that's perfectly all right. So active, reflective learners, think, pair, share. Which one do you think you are? And can you think of an incident in your learning life where this worked poorly or well for you? So a little time to think. And actually, let's try this. As you're thinking, so we can have an indication of where people are under ruminations. If you're an active learner, raise your hand, and I'll put it over to this side over here. And if you're a reflective learner, so toss it over to that side over here. So if we look across the room, we'll start seeing this series of levers. So, wow, this is fascinating. Yeah, my parents are always correct. So take a look around. Look at your hand, look at your neighbor's hand. Are they the same? Are they different? Talk.
Hey, Mel.
Yeah.
Hi. Can you please explain the difference between sensing and intuitive?
In a few minutes, yes.
Oh, okay.
We'll do them one at a time. So does anybody have a cool learning story to share from the active reflective? Does anybody have an interesting story that came up at the table that they wanted to share? Nobody? One person.
Followed all 8 of, oh, hey, thanks. Wow. My take from it was that I can remember scenes from my own learning ongoing where I have done all 8 of those things, and I don't know how to categorize myself.
So that is a great point. These are not hard binaries. They're spectrums and there's vocabulary you can use to describe yourself. Different people find themselves popping up in different places in the spectrum depending on what they had for breakfast that morning, how they're feeling, what the subject is. Most people tend to, more of the time, sometimes prefer one more than the other, but that doesn't mean that you can't have elements of both. So, and it's completely possible to be smack dab in the middle of any of these things. Let's go with sensing intuitive. Sensing intuitive is from the Myers-Briggs typology indicator, and it's, do you like dots or do you like connections between dots? So sensing people tend to learn things as nodes. They see graphs and they focus on the nodes. They look at the details. Whereas the intuitive folks look at the links and the relations between the concepts. And again, it's not one or the other, but if you had to think of whether one was more dominant, or whether you can't get something until you have all the facts right, or whether you can't get something until you can find connections between those things, that might give some clues. They also tend to have a preference for established methods versus new shiny things. And the sensing people with facts tend to be more slow and methodical, whereas the intuitive people tend to go super, super fast, trying to connect everything at the same time. And so usually the advice is speed one up, slow the other down. And the general question that these people tend to ask themselves from learning is, first of all, how does this connect with the world I know? How do these individual little bits of facts connect with things that I already have in my mind, that mental schema, versus the theoretical, how does this abstract more generally? Can this become a more general purpose library? Does this exemplify some sort of algorithm that I've heard about before? And so sensing intuitive, once again, let's do the little, so sensing intuitive. Wow, I think we seem to have a predominance of intuitive people here. That is really interesting. There's a bunch of sensors. There's some people that are right in the middle. Okay, so we'll do the pair part, but not the share part. We'll do the share and the Q&A at the end if people have questions. So look at your partners, share stories. Okay, I'm going to pause the choice thing for a moment and charge on into visual verbal, which is fairly self-explanatory. This is visual. This is verbal. Any questions? And one implication of this is development environments matter. So when I was at Hacker School this summer, we talked a little bit about what does, since programming is such a text-heavy environment, if you are a visual learner, what do you do? And people had all sorts of things like, well, I make sure that my desk has the spatial layout and my mouse is always here and this book is always here and my coffee is always there. And some people wax poetic about the font they chose for the editor and the way they tiled their windows. And so there are a lot of things, even if you're in text, that you can do if you're a highly visual person. So going through this a little more quickly. Visual, verbal. Okay. And I want to pair this one for thinking, pairing, and sharing with the last one. So hold on a minute, and then we'll do the group talky thing again. Sequential and global is probably, at least for me, the most surprising one I hadn't heard about before. So sequential learners are the ones that most learning experiences, whether they are books, whether they are classes, whether they are self-paced tutorials or working through online, they are mostly designed for sequential learners. Sequential learners, as the name implies, learn things in sequence. And so they're learning over time, looks nicely like this, whereas global learners need to get the entire picture before anything in that picture makes sense. And so as a global learner, you usually wander in this haze of confusion for a long time, and then one day the light of the heavens opens and shines down upon you, and everything makes sense. And so if you're in classes, the question is, does the semester end here, or does it end here? And it's interesting to think about the difference between confused global learners and global learners, because global learners aren't just slow sequential learners. Global learners also tend to, once they have this moment, sequential learners can very clearly tell you if they have a solution, how did they think of that solution? Whereas global learners, sometimes things will just kind of make sense to them and they'll say, I know this is going to work. I don't know why it's going to work, but it's going to work, and that's the answer. But also, again, sometimes team classes can happen. We're like, how do you mean you don't know how that's going to work? And so I pulled up a couple of examples of nice Python learning and programming learning materials to think, are these designed for sequential learners? Are they designed for global learners? And if you are a sequential or a global learner, how might you approach and address some of these? So here's one. Here's another one. And so we're going to do this one with, so can we see visual versus verbal hands one more time? Just to remind ourselves, visual, verbal. Okay. And now can we see sequential and global? That's interesting. All right. So now, with your table mates together, how have these things impacted learning experiences you've had? All right. So there's going to be a lot more time for these sorts of conversations over lunch. But one of the things I wanted to point out, we tend to teach the way we learn. We tend to teach for people whose learning styles are close to ours. So as a visual learner myself, I tend to teach for other visual learners. And so one thing to keep in mind is that my students may not be visual learners, and we might want to make things equivalent for other people. The other interesting thing they found was that most math, science, engineering faculty are in the minority for learning styles and are completely opposite the learning styles of most of their students, which explains a lot of why sometimes math classes may not be that great. But because everyone has these different styles and people teach the way they like to learn, one of the things that comes out of this is something we already know. The world is socially constructed. Well, of course it is. Why is the stuff that we use, the tools we use, the languages we use, the way they are? It's not because they beamed down from heaven that way. It's because some person made it this way, and that person had particular styles and ways of thinking. But this is an assumption that typically belongs to more mature learners. So especially if you're teaching kids, or we're teaching younger people, or people who are new to this world, they tend to have this kind of assumption instead of that one. So shifting the thinking from something, there's a bug in me, to there's a bug in the procedure that I'm using, helps externalize that, which also helps with motivation. And so motivation, just going through very quickly, people sometimes don't care, and then you can move through the spectrum of I'm doing this because someone else is making me, and I'm doing this because I know it's good for me and I got a job, to this is really cool. Most of the time, we want people to be over here because we think it's really cool, and we want them to think it's really cool. But it's okay if they're amotivated to externally motivate them a bit so that they can get to this hump. And these three things, autonomy, which is independence, relatedness, which is how much does this hook up with something that I already care about, and competence, which is I think I'm pretty decent at this. These are the three necessary and sufficient things to move people from this part of the scale to that part of the scale. So if you have people and they don't really seem to be caring, or if you are in a situation and you don't really seem to be caring, think about which of these three levels could you turn up a little bit and work on that. Attribution theory, just throwing a bunch of vocabulary at you right now, is the idea of, am I innately born with this talent, or do I cultivate it? And the growth mindset is it's because of hard work. And self-efficacy is a particularly interesting point. Self-efficacy is basically a fancy word for, do I think I have the capacity to do this? It's basically self-confidence. And this is in order the things that affect your self-confidence. And obviously the first one is, if you do it, then you can probably do it again. But number two and number three, seeing other people doing stuff and having a little bit of social pressure and friends and teachers saying, yeah, you can, prompts your body. So you can be sitting in your chair, freaking out, sweating, your stomach is having butterflies all over, and that can be completely overridden by good friends and by good example. And so this is a great picture of, this is from the One Laptop Per Child project, and all these kids are crowding around, and there's the social support going on, and this kid in the middle is probably doing something really cool, and these kids around him are probably going to do something really cool when they get back to their computers too. At a hacker school, someone said, well, what does this look like over time? And this is what learning looks like over time. Michael Fullan did some interesting research. It's like, when you implement some really cool new process or you learn something, the first thing it does is it makes you suck at life. And that's called an implementation dip, but I like to call it pain. And so every time you learn something, you go through that dip, and then you have this plateau where your new skill is sort of coming and maturing. And on that plateau, what's happening is described mostly by Piaget. And assimilation and accommodation are the two big words he used to describe this. Assimilation is when you have a schema and you add things to what's already there, and accommodation is when you go, oh my gosh, this no longer works, we have to redo everything, and we have a very, very familiar example of this here. But the point being here is that accommodation is not better than a simulation. Like, again, one is not better than the other, they're just different. And especially when you're teaching more esoteric concepts like, objects sometimes confuse people the first time they come across them, or even functions, or decorators. I'm still kind of confused by decorators sometimes. Sometimes people really like a simulation, because it lets them keep on doing what they're doing. And so they will painfully write, 300-line pieces of code that don't have any functions because they can, and they don't want to refactor it. But this is the same sort of logic, like when Python 3 came out, people didn't immediately jump ship. There are reasons to stick with old practices. There are reasons to maintain old things. And so it is a balance, and it's not necessarily new things are shining, you must jump on them right away. This is getting into the territory of situative learning, where all these things, all these conversations, we start hearing hints of how they take place in community. Not just in isolation of our own individual little brain, but that learning makes sense, and learning is learning because other people that we know count it and attribute it as learning. So again, learning in community in Hacker World and Python World, excellent. And that brings me to the third and last point, which is we do not learn by ourselves. Learning lives outside our brain. If I learn that someone else I know knows something, that's almost as if I had learned it myself, because then I know I can ask them. I don't need to spend 20 hours working through something until the moment that I need it. And I love this picture in part because, as the project name implies, one laptop per child had each child have a laptop, and yet we see this. And so I think we're running shorter on time. I wanted to leave a giant swath of time for questions, which is right about now-ish. And so I will put a page full of funny words that I was thinking about explaining on the screen, and you can ask me about any of those, and or share stories you thought were interesting from the table talking, or ask any other questions you would like. So I will formally pause here, see if there are any questions. Yeah, there's one microphone floating around, and there's also one at the front.
Thank you. So most of the teaching that I've done of programming has been one-on-one, and it hasn't been to a group of beginners. And the difficulty that I'm realizing is that it's been very goal-directed. It's like the person comes to me saying, like, I really want to learn programming using the solution to this one problem that I need to solve. And so we become super focused. Hello. We become super focused on solving their problem, but I entirely forget to pay attention to how they're learning, or how they need to learn. So I'm trying to understand a better way to approach that.
A better way to approach, is it reminding yourself to step back and think about
Maybe that's it.
Okay.
Like, I guess my real question is, how can I teach them more effectively about like things that I think are important for them to know on the whole, as problem-solving strategies, when both the learner and I are focused on like solving the immediate problem that they want to do.
Okay. First note, I'm wading into the audience because I need lip read. But if I understand your question correctly, it's when I'm teaching, how do I get students to be able to step back and think about what's important about what they're learning, but also about the learning strategies they're using?
Close. I'm saying, how can I step back and help the learner learn not just how to solve a task, but how to think?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that was in a later slide. And part of the reason why I stop at this point is the rest of my slides are from the version of the talk I've done before. So if you really want to see the extended talk, it's already online. But, here we go. My favorite picture back again. So when teachers in school were asking exactly that same question, how can we as instructors step back and teach our students how to think through problems. They came up with cognitive apprenticeships, which was gained from the idea that apprenticeships, if you're an apprentice and you're working in a woodworking shop, you'll see all these people in front of you at different stages in their development, different learning styles, everything, making cabinets, making chairs, making beds. And that multi-mastery apprenticeship teaches you not just about making cabinets, but the process of making cabinets, how people work through the process of making cabinets, how do they design cabinets, how do they fix mistakes in cabinets, all that stuff. But with cognitive things like programming, a lot of it happens in here, so how do we expose our thought processes to students? And they came up with these 4 little things as keys they could use to remind themselves what to do. And so modeling is, most of these are fairly easy to guess, but modeling is, all right, stop and watch while I do it. I'm going to show you an example. I might think out loud. And then coaching is, I step back, the student's doing it, but I'm basically backseat driving. And so you're giving him, okay, now type this, now hit that button, now press that. And then over time, the scaffolding grows less and less and less. So one example might be if you're teaching someone software engineering about bug reporting, how to report bugs, you might model, oh, we have a problem. Okay, what am I going to do? I'll report the bug. Look, Bugzilla. And then coaching people through gradually increasing parts of that same task. So first you might say, why don't you come up with a title, and then we'll write the body together. All right, why don't you come up with a title and then take a first stab at the body, and then we'll go over that together. And over time, that scaffolding fades until the student is doing that task independently. So that's one structure that they found for themselves, and being able to think through that sequence as mnemonic to help with metacognition. Is that useful?
Very much so, thank you.
Cool. Other question? Not only do you get the microphone, you get the presenter.
Sorry, making you run all the way. So we had a few thoughts. One of them, so I love these kinds of measurements, but linear scales are pretty limited. And I think that some of those things aren't on a linear scale. So I've been reading Temple Grandin's new book, The Autistic Brain, and she really believes there's not just visual and verbal thinkers, there's also people who are primarily pattern thinkers. And I would hazard a guess, since we're in a room of software people, there's probably a lot of pattern thinkers in the room.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe that's why, because for that one, people seemed a little more like, oh, where do I put my hand? I'm like, well, maybe you're actually not on that linear scale. You might be off in this other spot. So that was one thought. And then the other was, between intuitive and sensing, I think that if you're too far on either side, it's hard to do software. Like, you need to be able to look at data, but you also have to be able to make intuitive leaps. And so I feel like I'm quite in the middle of that, and many people I work with are too. So anyway, those are 2 of my main thoughts.
Thank you. Very, very cool. Other thoughts, questions? I can. Alrighty.
So I kind of wonder, what is your take on when you're teaching people? A lot of people tend to be overconfident about their abilities. They kind of tend to think they're here. The teacher may not agree. What are the best kind of bits and pieces you found that help with that?
Okay. So to make sure I understand the question is, how do you deal with people, students, who are overconfident about their abilities and think that they are better than they actually are?
Maybe. I mean, they might be as good, but sometimes it's just not as demonstratable. Maybe you just can't be seen, or you can't really teach them something and they think they already got it. Like, I don't need to unit test. My code works as is. And people use it, so clearly it's awesome.
Okay. And so how do you delve in a little deeper and test what level?
Yeah, how do you teach them that they should, for example, do something like tests, even though they don't really believe in that?
So I would give 2 answers to that question. The first one is, if they think they know it, have them try to do this. If they think they know it, they should be able to teach it. They should be able to model it. They should be able to explain what they're doing as they think through the process, and they should be able to get someone else who doesn't know it into some sort of understanding and functionality in that capacity. The second thing I would say, it's the next slide, There are different levels of knowing stuff, and I use this scale a lot, but basically the idea is, there are novices, and there are people who are really good, and then there's this range of things in between. This is not particularly groundbreaking. But the difference between an expert and a novice at each stage is the acquisition of context. And so it's like when you're learning to cook, you need a cookbook with really, really explicit instructions. And it says, to boil water, put water on stove, turn stove on. And then when you're really good at cooking, you need less of that and just say, water, boil, chicken, add. And the recipe books are actually really constraining. So one way you can use to gauge where they're at and help them understand where they're at is what level of context do they need to be able to perform or express whatever task that they're describing. So is it, oh, I understand decorators, but I only understand decorators in the context of this one tutorial I've followed line by line, and outside that I'm lost? Or is it, oh, I understand decorators. I can sit down and write haiku about decorators in my sleep. And so that's another way to gauge. So what kinds of extended resources do you use to draw on? So.
Got time for one more question?
Okay.
As you're teaching, how do you recognize where on these scales your students lie so you can most effectively teach them?
Which scale?
Sort of the 8 or the 4 pairs we looked at in particular.
Those, so, where was it? Somewhere. This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question was, as I'm teaching, how do I recognize where my students are on this so that I can effectively teach them? And the question is, often I don't have that luxury. I'm teaching too many students at once. Or a lot of times I don't teach live. I'll write things and I'll put tutorials on my blog or I'll post them online, and then I just really have no idea. So if you're just teaching 1 or 2 people at a time, you can go through this and ask them. But what I do is, since I teach at the college level, I'm dealing more with adult students. I'm not sure how far down this tends to go. I give them the responsibility for their own learning. So I'll put this up in the first week of class and say, this is something that you might want to think about. This is personally what my styles are, and so when I forget, this is what I'm going to tend to teach like. Please feel free to remind me so that they can give me more specific feedback on, I really need this put in more context because I'm a global learner and you're a little bit too sequential. So giving them the vocabulary to advocate for themselves, giving them some of the skills. I mentioned a couple of coping mechanisms you can use to adjust the environment to fit you regardless of what that environment is. Sharing that with them and saying, do this. I will not be insulted if you stop paying attention to my class and start doodling on the side if that's what's going to help you learn better today. And giving them that permission.
Thank you.
I'll also be around during lunch if people want to talk more about this or see the rest of the stuff.
Okay. Let's give Mel Chua a warm applause for the talk.